Okay, who's next? Yeah, please. Excuse me, sit down. You weren't called. Sit down. Sit down. Sit down. Go ahead. No, you don't. You haven't been called. Go back to Univision.
Today, the party of Lincoln has become the party of Trump.
Hillary Clinton using Donald Trump's confrontation with Univision's Jorge Ramos to attack the entire Republican Party. And it's time now for our Sunday Group syndicated columnist, George Will. Christi Parsons, who covers the White House for the Los Angeles Times. The head of Heritage Action for America, Michael Needham. And Sheryl Gay Stolberg of the New York Times. Well, let's go back to that Des Moines Register poll on Democrats. Again, it shows Bernie Sanders is now closed to within 7 points of Hillary Clinton, as she has lost 1/3 of her support since May among likely Democratic caucus goers. George, the person running the poll said that this feels like 2008 all over again, referring, of course, to the race in which Hillary Clinton had a big lead and then got swept by and beaten by Barack Obama. What's going on?
Well, although she was just seen there complaining about Donald Trump, she should get up every morning and thank the Lord for Donald Trump, because he's distracting attention from her troubles. Now imagine what she'd be in this poll if all the attention of the country were focused on her, because the more she campaigns and the more people see of her, the less they seem to like her. Partly this is because in the Republican Party, the energy is on the right, and the Democratic Party is on the left, and Bernie Sanders is where the energy is. But a very talented Democratic poll taker, Peter Hart, says, go back to every election since the Second World War, start with Truman Dewey. With the exception of the Nixon elections, the most likable candidate wins. Take all your algorithms and fancy measurements. Likability matters, and people do not seem to like the product.
You're talking about Hillary Clinton.
Correct.
Christi, I'm sure somebody else is looking at that poll. Is it the vice president's residence here in Washington? Joe Biden is somebody who covers the White House. Best sense, is he going to get into this race or isn't he? And from your reporting, who would the president and his top advisors favor if it ends up being Clinton versus Biden?
It's so hard to tell if the vice president will really get into this race. What is clear is that he is looking at it very seriously. And I think it's going to be quite a while before we have a decision. He has said that by the end of the summer he would let us know what he was thinking. But in the last week, the LA Times has reported that it may be January or February before Joe Biden makes up his mind about what to do.
You're saying he wouldn't get in time for the first Democratic debate in October?
Maybe not. If the thinking is that he wants to preserve the ability to get in later, he may not be in that first debate. Of course, it would be helpful to him, but the thinking of the among the folks around Biden is that he doesn't have to be out there campaigning like everybody else. If this were a situation where he did get in closer to the primaries in the early caucus states, then he's known there. People like him. He's got some folks in the party who really like to see him run and would be there to help him.
Is the thought then that this would be a kind of Hillary collapses and I'll come in to pick up the pieces strategy?
I think some people see it that way, but I also think there's a big respect factor going on here, and this is something we've been hearing for months at the White House about Joe Biden. There's a lot of respect for the 40 years he's spent in politics and for the service he's given to the Obama administration, and all along the idea has been he has the right to make the choice based on his own considerations. And I think that's what you saw. You asked me does the president favor one over the other? Right now, the president's going to great lengths to do a couple of things. One is to not show favoritism between the two. I think he has made it clear to people around him that he likes both, thinks both would be great. But he also doesn't want to disrespect his vice president. And putting heavy pressure from the sitting president, he feels would be insulting.
And also, obviously, excuse me, Biden is going through a personal tragedy. It's not just political for him. Michael, let's take a look at the new Des Moines Register poll when it comes to Republicans. Donald Trump is still leading, but Dr. Ben Carson is now at 18%, just 5 points behind Trump, and all the governors, all the senators are in single digits. What is going on?
Well, one of the great myths is that Washington, D.C. is broken. Washington's not broken. It's a finely tuned machine, and it works well for incumbent politicians, their consultants, and the K Street lobbyists who get rich off the game. And so the fundamental question of this election, which all the outsiders, Donald Trump, Carly Fiorina, Ben Carson, and even somebody like Ted Cruz get right, is do you understand that Washington, D.C. is a swamp, and are you coming to drain it? And that's why you're seeing all of these outsiders take off. And on top of that, Donald Trump is adding to the conversation, pointing out that there's a bipartisan consensus not to build the wall. Carly Fiorina is doing a great job of highlighting the cronyism that pervades Washington, D.C. Ben Carson is talking about the lack of virtue in this country. And so all of them are absolutely in touch with the populist conservative bent of Republican primary voters who are absolutely sick as they learn more and more about how corrupt the rigged game of Washington, D.C. is of the status quo.
It's not just Washington, because, you know, you've got the governor of Wisconsin, you've got the governor of Louisiana, a variety of, quote, outsiders, at least in terms of Washington. It seems that it's the political class, not just the Washington political class.
That's exactly right. The political class in this country is failing our nation. Our nation wants to talk about things like the fact that they can't afford to send their kid to college, that they're anxious about whether they're going to have a job, worrying about health care premiums. Politicians run on those things. Politicians ran in 2014. We'll stop Obamacare. We'll stop the president's unlawful amnesty. What do when they actually get elected? They go in there and they try to pass a patent reform bill that K Street wants. They go in there and they reauthorize No Child Left Behind, George W. Bush's failed education bill. The politicians, the political class in this country is ignoring the will of voters. That's what people are rebelling against, and that's what Donald Trump, Carly Fiorina, Ted Cruz, Ben Carson, all of these outsider candidates are tapping into.
Meanwhile, Sheryl, to go back to the Democratic race, your paper, the New York Times, had a fascinating story this week in which they surveyed, I think it was 75 Democratic officials, Democratic candidates running in state races, Democratic donors, who expressed growing frustration, maybe not with the details of the email scandal, but with Hillary Clinton's seeming inability to get ahead of it and to put it to rest.
I think that's absolutely right. The paper surveyed about 75 Democrats. Democrats are absolutely apoplectic over this. Ed Rendell, the former governor of Pennsylvania, said that the Clinton campaign has handled this atrociously. And the concern, as you said, is not so much with the details. Was there classified information or wasn't there? But really with the broader perception that Hillary Clinton has done something that most Americans wouldn't do or wouldn't expect a government official to do, which is conduct public business on a private server. And this issue isn't going to go away. Now, some Democrats feel that Mrs. Clinton did a little bit better job this week. She, in Iowa, or Nebraska rather, accepted responsibility. She said, I know that maybe this wasn't the best decision. I accept responsibility for doing this. But, you know, this is a long time coming, this kind of explanation, and she's got a long way to go. In October, she will testify before the House on Benghazi. The issue of these emails will be front and center.
You've also got the FBI, which has a hold of her server, and who knows what they're going to find on that.
That's true, but I do think the spectacle, frankly, of her becoming a witness in a House hearing and is just going to kind of continue this churning over her
so
emails.
Do you think that
it casts a cloud
so
over
do
her
you think
campaign.
from the Democratic grassroots, or at least in this case from the Democratic state, local level of officials, that there's a growing sense maybe we need somebody other than Hillary?
I think this is a big reason, frankly, that we're seeing Joe Biden considering a run for the White House, because there is a growing unease, and we're also seeing, you know, Bernie Sanders, as you mentioned, bubble up for an entirely different reason, because there's an energy, as George said, in the Democratic Party with the progressive side of the party. That is not the Hillary Clinton wing of the party.
Well, I agree with that. Energy matters, and right now the people translating energy into noise are the ones prospering. But there's an aspect of the Des Moines Register poll on the Republican side that interests me. It's favorable, unfavorable. Two Republican candidates are over 70 in favorable. Ben Carson at 79, Scott Walker at 71. They both have very low unfavorables. What do the two have in common? They're both calm. Dr. Carson is almost sleepy. And Walker, with that kind of Wisconsin niceness and Midwestern calm, maybe the voters are saying, making a disconnect between those who shout and those who are nicer.
There's no politician who does a better job than Senator Mike Lee of Utah of combining that optimistic vision with a willingness to take on the broken Washington status quo. But to miss that second part absolutely disqualifies you to be the Republican nominee. And so they're going to have to, as George is alluding to, channel both that optimistic vision and a willingness to take on the status quo.
All right, we have to take a break here, but we'll see you a little later in the program.